very grateful to be here. I'm going to try to not distract myself with such fun and exciting things like talks at my alma mater. So it did really help, preparing for today did really help me kind of feel like I'm coming full circle and think about how I frame my research within broader contexts, though I do need to go and hide at the library for the next 3 months. So a bit more about myself, of course, yes, I did the Professional Communication Bachelor of Arts here. At the same time, I worked as a research assistant in human-robot interaction, audience studies with Charles, and was also through TMU, got an internship at CBC where I studied misinformation during the 2018 Ontario election. And that was really what got me thinking about mis and disinformation. All the research work I did here inspired me to be better at doing every part of the research process, from questions to methods to answers to dissemination. So I then went to the UK and did a master's degree in data science. And by meeting somebody in a bar the day after Twitter released their data sets of state-backed influence operations, met an academic in a bar and he said, we're gonna write a paper together. And I said, I don't know what I'm doing, but sure. And it worked out really well, because it turns out he knew my now supervisor at Oxford, and that letter of recommendation was probably quite strong, I would hope. So yes, bringing together communication studies and data science applied to disinformation research is really my bread and butter and what I'm working on at Oxford. So I feel like I'm kind of on both sides of the coin, looking at what, studying the disinformation and also the countermeasures. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Is that going to work? Thank you. Do you mind moving that down, because there might be stuff up there that I want. Or sorry, the text to the bottom there, because there won't be anything there. That's fine. Yeah, cover the lab. That's fine. Cool. So we're going to go over definitions. There are a lot of definitions in this field, and even to me, still they are quite confusing. That's why I tried to start with online harms and then getting a little bit more specific. Then we're going to talk about the impacts of disinformation and online harms, of which there are many on different groups of people in different parts of society. Then we're going to get into it's all fun to me, but the fun stuff of countermeasures, and I'll go over 2 pieces of research that I've worked on over the last couple of years. The first with the lab, this is the Research Center for Democracy and Technology at Oxford, on social media platform interventions to counter the spread of misinformation, and then on my own research on Ukrainian strategic communications and political communication during the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and how that I see as a countermeasure to Russian disinformation. After that overview of countermeasures and those 2 studies, I then have one slide to talk about the solutions in communication studies and the creative industries. Super keen to talk with you guys after, because I understand, of course, we're co-hosted by the practice-based PhD here. So lots of ideas on how we can, think about responses to mis and disinformation that way. Right, does this work? Still not working. Well, it's okay. So I want to paint a picture for all of us. Exactly a year ago, in January of 2024, Taylor Swift was halfway through her Eras tour. And I don't know where she was at that point. I know she ended in Canada, but January 2024, at the same time she's doing her tour, there's a group of people on a 4chan board. So 4chan is a messaging platform where there have been terrorist attacks organized on the platform. It's had a lot of controversies on that platform. A group of people were in communication trying to circumvent the safety measures of generative AI tools to see if they can get around the measures that are meant to stop them from creating sexualized imagery. They succeeded, and they created several pieces of AI-generated deepfake pornography of Taylor Swift. And they published it online, and it went viral. The most, one of the known pieces, the most popular one, got 47 million views. On other social media platforms, it went beyond 4chan once it went viral, before it was taken down. And there were, this was a big targeted attack at a global icon, showing the misogyny that can happen using tech platforms, and really an attempt at slut-shaming Taylor Swift. And there were a lot of reactions that happened, and this is what I want to kind of capture with the presentation today. the bad stuff that happened, and then what were the reactions? First and foremost, Taylor Swift didn't stay completely silent. Her legal team did put out a statement about how the posts were abusive and exploitative. American politicians actually came together from both sides of the aisle and proposed a bipartisan bill to give targets such as Taylor Swift, or even students have been found to be targeting other students around the world using tools that create deepfake pornography of anybody, right? So it's not just a celebrity problem, but it was a bipartisan bill to try to tackle these digital forgeries. And then also social media platforms. X at that point did temporarily block searching for Taylor Swift. Whether or not that's the right thing to do, they did do something. But it was the Swifties that did something really cool. They actually tried to hashtag, where you kind of hijack a hashtag, the hashtags that were used to spread the deepfakes of Taylor Swift with positive content about her. So they tried to really help her reclaim the narrative in this kind of ground up, really public campaign. And I'm sharing this story firstly to emphasize how this incident is a stark reminder of how easily technology can be weaponized. Any best practices or best attempts at having safeguards around technology so that it's not used for harm like this can be circumvented. Just like the creativity that it takes to think of these safety measures, it takes creativity to get around them as well. The response to this crisis also shows that responses can and should happen at multiple levels between the targets, policy, and also the public. And of course, I think the Swifties' response was nothing short of genius. It was a really, really smart thing to take these really harmful hashtags and creatively come up with their own counter messaging campaign to support somebody who they really look up to. So, next slide, please. Sorry, switch it on my phone, and I think it switched up there. So the TLDR of my whole presentation, I like to put this up front. I swear there's more slides after this. But it's first and foremost that online harms are increasing and demand proactive, adaptable solutions to ensure safe and appealing online spaces. The World Economic Forum has said that disinformation tops their global risks last year. And also, lots of research has been put out there about foreign information manipulation operations manipulate social media to influence your views. Effective countermeasures need to operate at multiple levels, from spreading information in the public eye, government actions, and platform actions. An interesting example is Finland has really been kind of at the forefront of media literacy and information literacy education, not just for children in schools, but also for adults in adult learning classrooms. And finally, creative communicators play a vital role in crafting impactful responses to online harms. So an example of that is Go Viral. Has anyone heard of Go Viral by any chance? I'm sure Philip has. So that's a 5-minute game that helps protect you against COVID-19 misinformation, just as one example of gamifying information literacy, essentially. So on to definitions. Thank you very much. So overall, online harms. I wanted to frame this presentation with online harms as kind of the broadest term I could possibly think of doing that with. And that really broadly is behaviors or online content which may hurt a person physically or emotionally. So behaviors or content, it's not just about the post itself, the words themselves, the image itself. It's also about the manipulative ways that are used to try to spread that information online. So, for example, trying to game a social media platform to spread harmful content more widely. There's the harmful content, but then there's also the gaming of a system, an algorithm, for example, to try to make it go further. Hurting a person physically could broadly be seen as causing stress, fear, can broadly be seen as offline actions such as, unfortunately, suicide, violent protests, or terrorist attacks, just as a few examples. And then hurting a person emotionally could really be about causing stress, fear, anxiety in somebody, or making them act in a way that they wouldn't have otherwise that causes harm, so such as scamming somebody into a fraudulent purchase or convincing them that a voting day is moved and they therefore do not vote in an election. So let's go through the main types of online harms from the UK government. The first is threats to personal and community safety. So that could be child abusive or sexualized material or content that promotes violence. The second is harm to health or well-being. That could be materials that promote suicide or self-harm, or developmentally inappropriate content, so something that is okay for 18 plus being shown to a 10-year-old. The next is hate and discrimination. So hate speech, or again, algorithmic discrimination, where, for example, telling a group of voters based on ethnicity, targeting them that way, that a voting date has been changed so that that group that maybe is more likely to vote for an opponent is less likely to show up and vote. The next is violation of dignity, so that could be bullying and harassment. And finally, deception and manipulation. So next slide, please. And I've got the kind of subsets actually up on the screen now. So first and foremost is mis and disinfo, and I'll define that on the next slide. Deceptive synthetic media, that would be the Taylor Swift example, impersonation, scams, phishing, catfishing, all of these fun things. So onto mis and disinformation. So disinformation is purposeful use of false information to deliberately deceive. That would be the initial post that says voting day has been moved when it hasn't been. Misinformation would be false or misleading information that is spread without the specific intent to deceive. So it could be the same piece of content. That would be a member of that community sharing it with their friends and family saying, FYI, the voting has been moved, but they didn't know it. They're unknowingly sharing the disinformation. And then malign influence campaigns are kind of the means of spreading those initial pieces of content. So that's the purposeful efforts to skew how people see the world with that example of elections. And next slide, please. So, and that the example that I gave is actually something that in 2016 was found to be one of the many kind of parts of the malign influence campaigns by Russian state-sponsored troll farms, targeting African Americans on social media, telling them that the election had been changed, the date. So the objectives of these malign influence campaigns, I think these are the three key ones. There are smaller ones. First and foremost, and where a lot of my research lies, is political malign influence campaigns with political objectives. So on the left is not an image of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. It's a screenshot of a deepfake video of him where he is, seen to be telling Ukrainians to lay down arms, return to their families, and stop fighting at the start of the full-scale invasion in 2022. That here, like none of it's him, but the way that it would have been created is that an actor would stand up at a podium like this, read out the script that some script writer has written, and then the AI generated face would be superimposed onto that actor's body. So that's not even Zelensky's shoulders, and I'll get to that in a second. The second is financial, and literally last week, my friend messaged me. We're both quite frugal folks. She messaged me saying, oh my God, this designer brand I love is shutting down, and I just got 900 pounds worth of clothes for 250. This is a British friend. And it was in the morning, I was busy, and I said, oh my God, that's great, maybe I'll check it out because I'm frugal too. Come the afternoon, she messages me again saying, oh my God, Alexa, I'm an idiot. That was a scam. I've already canceled my credit card. I am not getting those boots or that cashmere sweater or that scarf. This literally happened last week, which is why then that evening I was scrolling down Facebook. She saw those posts on Instagram, and I happened to see this. Some brand called Marlowe with broken hearts announcing devastating news that they are shutting down because their flagship store was harmed. Somehow it was all broken up. And because of this, they don't have enough money to carry on, but they're having a blowout sale for everything they have left. If you look at there's kind of these stripy lines here. That was the first thing that made me think, this isn't a real picture. This is an AI-generated image to catch my attention, right? So those stripy lines, if you were to look at it in higher quality, as I did initially, and being able to zoom in high quality, those are just lines from generative AI that are not real. Also, the buildings on the top right, you can't tell at this quality, but they also, once you zoom in, like the lines of the architecture overlapping correctly, AI generated. So financial reasons for spreading disinformation and malign influence. Also clickbait farms, when a website will have really kind of salacious headlines, not always fake, but completely false, but misleading most of the time, to get you to click through, and then they get your advertising money. So financially motivated, definitely. And then finally, reputational, again, trying to shame Taylor Swift and tarnish her reputation by slut shaming her. The thing I want to emphasize with this is how creative each of these were. And I'm a Procom graduate, some of my friends went into PR. If they're having a real blowout sale, everything other than the AI generated image is going to be the same creative process of creating this campaign to promote the blowout sale. An actor had to, think of how he would act as closely to Zelensky as possible. A scriptwriter wrote the script that it was tailored towards the target audience of Ukrainian people who are in their towns and villages. And then again, kind of this gamification of getting around safety mechanisms is what was done here. So the creative practices are on both sides, and I think it's really important that we understand that and see that creativity can be used for kind of good and evil, and consider finding ways to support countermeasures against disinformation, like I'm trying to do with my research. So on to the impacts of these malign influence campaigns. So first and foremost is changes in behavior. I think that scam one is quite a good example from the last slide, changing your behavior and clicking through and making purchases. But also, during COVID, at least 800 people died around the world because of COVID-related misinformation. A study found that 5,800 people were admitted to hospital, largely from drinking methanol or alcohol-based cleaning products, I know, because they saw that was a way to, stop themselves from getting COVID. 800 of those people passed away, very, very sadly. The second is polarization. So I mentioned that the Russian troll farm with the African-American voters. Another thing in their large influence campaign was that employees somewhere in St. Petersburg who worked for the troll farm that ran that campaign with the voter suppression, they also organized in Houston, Texas, 2 protests. One that was for stopping the Islamization of Texas, so anti-Islam, and one that was for saving Islamic knowledge, so pro-Islamic knowledge, in front of the same Islamic center at the same time on the same day. So people were galvanized to come out and support the side that they supported most, which led to clashes, real clashes on the streets, and also led to people, being spurred into offline action more than they would have been had these Facebook events not existed in the first place. The third is distrust in targeted individuals and entities. And, the Taylor Swift example, trying to degrade her reputation would count here. This is a Ukrainian member of parliament named Svetlana Zalishchuk, where several years ago, images that purported to show her running naked around the streets of Kyiv were spread on social media saying that she had done this, and, therefore she's promiscuous and unfit for office is the attempted implication of a campaign like this. She didn't do anything. She stayed in politics. She ignored it. But a year or two later, a German journalist asked her if that was true, if she had actually run through the streets of Kyiv naked, which shows that the piece of disinformation had turned into misinformation and spread online enough to get into the brain of a German journalist who felt it was okay to ask whether or not that was actually her, this grainy image of a blonde person naked on a street. So these things do stick into people's minds and stay there and try to make people look more distrustful. The next is manipulated emotions. A lab study of 223 undergraduate students found that fake news and disinformation was able to manipulate their attitudes and emotions in a controlled study, but it did have an impact on their attitudes and emotions. And finally is the financial effects. Again, that example of fraud that I gave. Also, a finance worker in Hong Kong was once tricked into paying $25 million to the bank account of a person who created a live deepfake of his CFO in the bank or the company that he worked for. The guy sent $25 million because he was called on FaceTime by someone who deepfake looked like his CFO. So, you know, some impact, massive impact there. And then other people, like my friend, massive impact on her wallet for this month. I think she's getting the money back, but, you know, different levels of impact on that kind of financial front as well. So countermeasures to malign influence campaigns. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace has a really good report and framework that I like to use and think about when looking at countering disinformation effectively and malign influence campaigns. And there's three key types that they propose. The first is public information. So those interventions can include supporting local journalism so that there is more local journalism through money, through training. The second is media literacy education, which could be done on platforms where you might see a widget that explains a certain disinformation tactic to you, for example, or it can be done in schools. The next is fact checking, so creating the fact check, and also ideally being able to disseminate the fact check. Labeling social media content, so when something is found to be fake, ideally with a very well evidenced fact check, then putting that onto the social media post itself. And finally, counter messaging strategies, and I'll get into that in a bit when I talk about my research on Ukrainian politicians. The second is government action, so this could be cybersecurity for elections and campaigns, so that no information from a campaign can be hacked, which then could be leaked after. So just trying to keep things under wrap is always good, privacy-wise. And then finally, statecraft deterrence and disruption. This could be, you know, country-to-country diplomacy trying to deter countries from spreading disinformation, but also disruption could be shutting down accounts and networks, or also sanctioning the individuals who spread it themselves. And then finally, platform actions, removing inauthentic asset networks, reducing data collection and targeted ads, because if you can target someone really specifically, you're probably more likely to use a message that will resonate with them, because you can get more specific on who you're targeting. So one of the key recommendations is to make the kind of the sizes of people you're able to target to be, instead of 3, to be 300 minimum, for example. And then finally, changing recommendation algorithms, because as we know, in a lot of cases, researchers have found that really kind of inflammatory, hateful rhetoric tends to get ranked higher on some algorithms. So trying to make social media boring again might be able to decrease the algorithmic spread and promotion of disinformation and the cases of malign influence. So the researchers also have 3 caveats for their findings. The first is that there is no silver bullet or best policy option, and with that, a portfolio approach of trying to run multiple countermeasures is what should really be adopted. In this case, the report was more towards governments over democracies. And then finally, long-term structural reforms deserve more attention. We can shut down inauthentic networks, but they're probably just going to pop up on the same platform or on a different platform, and it becomes a bit of black control, as has been coined. Not by me, I'm not smart enough for that, but I do think it's a good one. Whereas media literacy for children may have a longer-term positive impact on their ability to discern content that's trying to manipulate their emotions or scam them and things like that. So now I'm going to dive into my research, and I am just halfway through, so that is good timing. So first, I'm going to talk about the platform actions. And next slide, please. Super. So this is a report that I published with several other fabulous co-authors called Strategies for Improving the Global Information Environment, Results from a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. So essentially what we did is we took all the papers we can find that mention fake news, a term we shouldn't use anymore, misinformation, disinformation, rumors, I don't know what else, huge list of terms. And we basically tried to boil down the research findings to understand, one, which countermeasures or interventions against misinformation to stop its spread are recommended the most, because we should at least appreciate what experts recommend. And then which ones, if there's enough evidence and it was a robust enough study that was trying to test these countermeasures, which ones is there actual evidence pointing towards them working? So systematic review, just a fancy literature review where everything is in a massive spreadsheet and you try to tabulate what is, the key themes, the key recommendations. And then a meta-analysis is where you actually, if you're able to compare apples to apples of a recommendation that's been tested in a specific controlled environment and has specific effects that have been reported in the study, pooling that information and tabulating averages, essentially. So fabulous. So the first research question was that systematic review question: which platform level misinformation countermeasures are endorsed by research? We started with almost 5,000 papers and bit by bit boiled it down to the 588 papers that actually recommended a countermeasure, were in English, mentioned misinformation, had legitimate citations, and that we were able to retrieve, essentially. So boiled it down to 588 between 2011 and 2022. I'll just name 4 of the countermeasures that end up being more important later. So the first one that we found a lot was content labeling. So this could be when a platform adds a disputed label next to a user post. So it stays up, but it's labeled. The second is content or account moderation. So this is downranking content on YouTube or reducing interactions with accounts that have been known to spread misinformation. The next is corrective information. So actually kind of publishing a debunk of a piece of content next to it. And then finally, information and media literacy. For example, Facebook probably used to offer tips to spot false news. So giving the media literacy training on the actual platform. So next slide. So again, that question we asked was which ones were endorsed most. That was corrective information, information and media literacy, content or account moderation, and content labeling. So of those 588, this was the number of publications that suggested it and just said, hey, this could be a good idea in the conclusion section of our paper that looked at something to do with this. The second one is about is where the papers got a little bit more detailed and said, okay, we explored content labeling in our study. We therefore suggest that you label content that is misleading. So it's a little bit more specific. The numbers are pretty similar. But then this was where it got quite interesting of which publications actually reported effects of the countermeasures, which ones was the key subject of the study to measure the impact of the countermeasures. And that's where it's actually about less than 20% of studies that examined effectiveness, which is fine. There's lots of research that needs to be done on mis and disinformation, but measuring the effects of countermeasures is a really important piece of that puzzle. So again, this is what is suggested and needs further research. The next slide, please. So then the second question was where we did that meta-analysis, and we looked at which countermeasures were more likely to be effective in mitigating the impact of digital misinformation where they actually measured it. So that was only 18 papers out of those, the almost 5,000 down to 588, down to 18, where we were able to compare apples to apples of the effects of these counter misinformation measures. And we pooled effect sizes using a random effects model that followed an established kind of protocol for doing meta-analyses. And we collected samples and effect sizes and other statistics to measure changes in information perception and how much people, if there's a decrease in how accurate people perceive a piece of misinformation to be, for example. And we had enough data to pool findings on the efficacy of 2 solutions, which were content labeling and corrective information materials. So really, we're really getting tight into the funnel here, but it's what's available, really. So these 2 charts, top to bottom, is all of the papers we were able to study for content labeling on the left and effects of corrective information on the right. The solid line here would be if the paper found 0 effect of the countermeasure, and you can see moving to the right, as the papers went down, they did find higher effect sizes. Basically, basically, generally, we found that these two countermeasures, the content labeling and corrective information, had medium to high effectiveness, but it still could be more statistically robust. So this doesn't mean that these two things are the silver bullet, but just that of the available information, there's more evidence for these two that it may actually have an impact on misinformation perceptions. Next slide, please. And again, so the two we were able to validate were the content labeling and the corrective information. The two further ones that were also endorsed would be content or account moderation and information and media literacy work as well. And then the next slide. And then all of these different ones, which I'm having to share a link of our paper afterwards, are uncertain because the recommendations that researchers made were not actually linked to the work that they did. So takeaways from this, first and foremost, is that proposed countermeasures, a lot of them are not actually tested, so there's room for more research there, or they're too broad. So, for example, some research said we need to provide more relevant information which builds fake news awareness. I don't know how to test that. We need to be a bit more specific in our terminology as well. And we need more strategic validation approaches to test countermeasures so that we have more apples we can compare against other apples to understand broader efficacy of countermeasures. Content labeling is cheaper than information and media literacy campaigns, and it's easier to test, which is a good thing, but I worry that it means that we kind of don't therefore do longer term or more kind of creative methodologies for studying the impact of media literacy campaigns, because they are more difficult to test, need longer term testing as well. So good to know which ones seem to be working, but that's also because they're easier to test. And also none of these countermeasures literally work without social media platform buy-in, unfortunately. Next slide. So so the second now piece that I like to talk about is the counter messaging strategies. And this is where I get into my PhD research. So next slide, please. So essentially, what I study is the communication of Ukrainian politicians on social media during Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I study it at a gendered, I put a gendered lens onto the research because women's voices are often excluded from wartime narratives, from digital diplomacy itself, and understanding the differing strategies can be valuable to having more creative approaches to digital diplomacy and counter disinformation, because we learn from people who we don't usually get to see in research or on the television screens. So that's the reason for the research. And next slide, super. So the key thing that I'm testing in my research is the women in peace hypothesis, which is the hypothesis that men are more inclined towards conflict and women towards pacifism and compromise. This is highly contested. It's probably why I want to study it, to give more research findings towards understanding whether or not it works, particularly in really salient conflicts such as the war in Ukraine, which is an all-out war encompassing the entire country. Some studies have shown that that's where this women's peace hypothesis does not stand up. But in non-conflict situations like here in Toronto today, that's where they tend to find more survey-based results that do find this. But I would argue that's not where you should be studying something like that, because it's not where people have to face it. And again, as I mentioned, women's voices are often excluded. And so digital diplomacy is really what I'm also broadly studying, so the utilization of social media by states to further policy objectives. And I'm running a topic analysis, which it's more the second and third. What I'm showing you is the first PhD paper. The second gets a little bit more into strategic narratives beyond the topics, which is compelling storylines that can explain events convincingly and from which inferences can be drawn. And again, that importance of disaggregating digital diplomacy. So the research questions. The first one is how does Ukrainian politician usage of Facebook and Twitter differ according to time period, gender, and language? The second is, to what extent do the narratives Ukrainian politicians discuss on social media fit expectations of gendered discourse? And finally, how do interaction styles of more and less prominent politicians on social media fit expectations of gendered discourse? So the data that I've got, it's 2 time periods that I studied. First was the 4 months a year before the full-scale invasion in February 2022, and then the first 4 months of the full-scale invasion. Of course, the war has been going on since 2013, but this was the best time period I could study of pre-full-scale invasion, because the year before was COVID, and the year before that was the election, so it got fuzzy. So this was the best attempt at having a temporal comparison. 56,000 Facebook posts collected from CrowdTangle, which is now dead. 23,000 tweets collected from the academic Twitter API, which is now dead, unfortunately. And from that, I got over 8,000 interactions to look at. So methods-wise, the two methods that I used, firstly was a structural topic model. And next slide, please. Thank you. So that calculates salient topics within a corpus of text. So in my case, social media posts. The structural part of the structural topic model is that instead of column A of just the posts themselves, you can also have a column B of gender, column C of time period, column D of social media platform, and then calculate which topics tended to be used more by women on Facebook before the full-scale invasion. So it really lets you get more granular and lets me get at my lens, of my gender lens, and be able to apply that. And then for looking at interactions, social network analysis, essentially what I did was take out the @mentions from the Twitter posts, so just on the Twitter posts, and calculate several network statistics to see where men and women sort of fell in who was reached out to the most in degree, who reached out the most out degree, and other network statistics. So research question 1. This is a table of the key kind of descriptive statistics on Facebook at the top and Twitter on the bottom. The left is before the full-scale invasion. I did fix that after. This was a screenshot, my apologies. And then during the full-scale invasion is on the right. And the thing to notice on Facebook is that even though the numbers really all increase, the percentages, the proportions between men and women posting, number of men and women posting, and the languages all stays pretty similar. So like, 10 to 11%, 0.4% to 3%, 11 to 14%. It all stays pretty similar, which kind of implies that Facebook was used to communicate with constituents because Ukrainian language was maintained as the very top one, but obviously politicians just posted more to their constituents after the full-scale invasion. Twitter is where it got really interesting in terms of digital diplomacy. Not terribly surprising, because that's where lots of political leaders do exist online. So pre-war time on the left, full-scale invasion, and on the right, full-scale invasion. Women went from being 17% of posts to 49%, so huge uptick in how much they were posting compared to men, and also they went up from being 24% of the posters, so more women politicians kind of jumped onto Twitter proportionally in that sense as well. And then the key other difference is that English used to be 21% of tweets before the full-scale invasion, and it jumped up to 79% during the full-scale invasion. So really seeing a lot more behavioral change on Twitter during the full-scale invasion than on Facebook. So what did they say? Next slide, please. So again, that second research question is about the narratives that politicians discussed, and that was with the topic analysis. So on the left is the key topics that came up from the structural topic model. Government affairs and infrastructure, typical governmenty things. We went and voted today, stuff like that, like in Parliament. Talking about people affected by the war, sharing calls for support, calls to action. Talking about the war in more of an optimistic way, like we will win. Talking about social and TV media appearances, and talking about Russia as the aggressor very overtly as some of the top ones. So the key differences here were that women published more calls for support, optimism about winning the war, and mentions of their appearances on social and television. And then men really more often called Russia the aggressor, discussed the military, and discussed sanctions. And the next slide, please. And then finally, how do the interaction styles change between men and women? So on the left, I had the lots of different network statistics I was able to calculate in Gephi after I pulled out the @mentions from all of these social media posts. And key takeaways are that women politicians in general @mentioned more other Twitter users than men did, despite there being fewer of them posting. The second was that prominent Ukrainian politicians had a higher than average in degree, so they were mentioned more than not prominent one. Prominent being president, former presidents, ministers, and party leaders was how I defined prominence there. And then finally, women politicians more often acted as bridging nodes between different kind of dense Twitter communities. So that was the betweenness centrality that was measured there. So they were really kind of in between trying to draw different people together. And the bonus question was who were the most reached out to Twitter accounts? And I found that 17 out of 20 were Western organizations, political leaders, security organizations. The other 3 were Zelensky and 2 other Ukrainian politicians, which makes complete sense. But it really shows that the target audience, and largely by women who were using the @mention affordance on Twitter more than men were really reaching out to their Western counterparts and stakeholders, and of course, sharing with them those calls for support or optimism about the war and that. So from political communication to counter disinformation. So politicians utilize different platform audiences and affordances to their advantage after the full-scale invasion. They really clearly saw that Twitter was the place to be to do digital diplomacy and to try to get that international support angle during the full-scale invasion, where Facebook is more for maintaining updates to constituents and safety and security of constituents. Women politicians also conveyed the human impact of the war and the need for Western support, rather than pacifist views. So this kind of disproves the women in peace hypothesis, in that women were not calling for compromise or sharing pacifist views, but interestingly, they were using probably topics that are deemed a bit more feminine, talking about the casualties of women, children, and civilians, as opposed to using more kind of terms of weapons, calling Russia the overt aggressor, which was what the men politicians did a bit more. So it disproves it, but it does still show that they sort of, for one reason or another, use more feminine topics, which is something I would love to do qualitative research on if anyone has funding, but that's for after 3 months from now. And then finally, women politicians, again, exemplified another kind of feminine expectation of alliance building consensus. There's other communication theories that men tend to communicate in a more lone wolf style to try to make decisions happen, whereas women are more consensus building towards a decision that they're trying to get at. So that did come up in the Twitter analysis. And as for how, so now I'm going to shift over to how I think that this is actually a counter-Russian disinformation campaign, because given that Ukrainian politicians' key target audiences were Western leaders, their narratives can be seen as a counter-brand strategy against Russian disinformation and propaganda. And there's kind of 2 parts to counter-brand, which is where you don't go tit for tat for every tiny little thing that Russia says and respond to it. You sort of rise above and rise a level above and say Russia is the aggressor, as opposed to Russia did this and that and this and that. So trying to get higher level in your narrative so you don't get caught debunking everything that the adversary says, because that takes up so much of your time and energy. So James Clement, who is a researcher at Lund University, suggests this strategy for mainly for governments. So instead of them getting stuck in the tit-for-tat debunking, they go a level above and share their strategic narratives. So that's what I think Ukraine is doing a lot in this situation. So what I'm going to do briefly now, because I've been laughing at you forever, is going through some of the key Russian disinformation propaganda narratives and then the responses from Ukrainians. So these are based on several pieces of research that have looked at key narratives used by Russia since the full-scale invasion. So the first, Russia calls itself a victim, but As a response, men say that Russia is the aggressor state, as we saw in the topic model, and women talk about Ukrainian civilians' lives being shattered by Russia. Arguably, that's kind of a counter brand because they're not tit for tat, but they're talking about the Ukrainian experience and what Russian aggression has done to them. Next, saying that the West is the aggressor, again, saying that Russia is actually the aggressor state. The next is Russia calling Ukrainians Nazis, trying to dehumanize them and also desensitize audiences to Ukrainian deaths. This, again, is countered by women saying that Ukrainian civilians' lives are what is shattered by Russia, rather than, no, we are not Nazis, being the kind of direct tit for tat that would be there. The next one, said by Putin quite often in different ways, is that Ukrainians are one people with Russia. I would argue that all of the key narratives by Ukrainians work to differentiate the two nations and show why Ukraine is fighting against Russia. Next is that Ukrainian unity and military are weak. Again, Ukrainian responses by men mainly is that the Ukrainian military is strong, and that by women and men together actually is that global unity will win the war. So again, not saying, no, we're not weak, but saying, you know, we are strong and global unity will help us maintain that. And then finally saying that the West is failing in terms of, because the war is going on. Again, that one about global unity. And finally, the Ukrainians also really saying we actually need more international support so that the West doesn't fail in this sense. So that's my, that's something that, this is something I'm trying to work on right now in a book chapter and talking about Ukrainian strategic communication as counter to Russian disinformation. So it's very much ongoing, but it's where I'm trying to bring my PhD again in the next 3 months. So to summarize these two sections again about countering malign influence campaigns, really needing an arsenal of response types from that systematic review meta-analysis. We found that content labeling and corrective information materials can be most effective. And then from my research in Ukrainian political communication, Ukrainian narratives have the potential to be powerful as counter-brand messages to Russian disinformation narratives to key target audiences, in this case of Western leaders, diplomats, and security organizations. And so for what we need more of, for social media platform responses, we need more global research. A lot of the research we were able to study was based in the US, on undergraduate students in the US about US-centric narratives. Also, we need more, again, non-English research, and also we need more access to data from social media firms. Don't even ask me what I'm going to do after I submit the PhD data-wise. I'll probably study Telegram because that's where there's actually data right now. Again, we'll see what the future research section looks like in that conclusion. And finally, for counter-messaging strategies, we need to learn from the varying strategies of diverse voices to understand what which ones work, which ones don't, and how they're different. And then finally, work to better measure responses from target audiences, which is what the second paper of my PhD does, but that's not the focus of today. And so finally, some thoughts on how communication research and creative industries can help tackle online harms. So first and foremost, diverse backgrounds and the power of cross-disciplinary collaboration. So in my work, sometimes I collaborate with political scientists. I guess I'm kind of a computer scientist, so I'm already doing two different things. Psychologists are really important in this fight, of course, communication studies. So it's lots of different fields that need to come together, including fields within the creative industries. The second is that communication scholars can help develop definitions that shape policy and platform actions. So needing better definitions for these communicative processes, they're evolving as we get to better understand them. And this is something that needs to continue. The next is countermeasures, like, you know, they can be really fun to design. Like Go Viral was probably really fun to design. I hope it's also being used, but it is a really interesting process in gamifying information literacy as just one example. And I think that, you know, especially the practice-based PhD, there's an opportunity to explore, I really think that could be a key area of research within it, of testing interventions, creating new interventions. And then finally, personally, I feel response-driven research is really rewarding. So when I get to do research and give recommendations, it makes me feel like my research is having a little bit more of an impact than it would otherwise. And the last thing I want to talk about is FCAT 580. I don't think there's any undergrads in the room, but essentially I co-lecture a course in the creative school with Professor Jonathan Anderson in interior design. And we bring, this July, we'll be bringing for the third year in a row, almost 50 creative school students to London. And it's all about the exciting bits of artificial intelligence in London and the UK, but I get to bring in the bad bits as well when I give my lecture on unethical generative AI vulnerabilities and trends. So, you know, I basically give students 45 minutes to use generative AI to create a disinformation campaign. I give them a framework to go through it. And then we talk about the different interventions and how they think we could, you know, put up more better safeguards and in, for example, AI image generation tools, or if that's even worth doing because you're just going to have 4chan chats trying to get around it. So it's a really interesting conversation. You know, they tend to go more on I'm more on the politics side of things. They tend to have Blake Lively out of sight as Taylor Swift and Ryan Reynolds, I think. Having a date together. So that was one of the things the students created within 45 minutes. And they had to get around, you know, asking for celebrities. And then if you press again, you'll get the video.
Election. I am pleased to announce my decision to run in the 2024 presidential election.
So that was a video that the students created in 45 minutes as well. This year, I'm gonna kind of lengthen the session by a little bit, and after they create this, I'm then gonna give them, I haven't decided yet how I'm gonna frame this, but I'm probably gonna give them really boring facts like milk is good for your bones and make them create really interesting, innovative communications campaigns to spread this truthful message as widely as they can, you know, create the plans for them, trying to do really quickly using generative AI and other emerging technologies. So I just wanted to share that as an example of courses and learning within the creative school as well. So thank you so much. I hope that was vaguely interesting and happy to answer questions.